Hey everyone, we've been taking a look at the rise of modernism of the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution and some of the urbanization and social impacts of the Industrial Revolution. And this lecture is going to take a look at Impressionism, which I'm going to argue is really the first major avant-garde movement of modernism. Some might say it's the first true modernist movement that's happening. What avant-garde means literally translates from French to the advanced guard. And it was originally a term that was used in the military. The advanced guard would be the ones that were on the watchtowers that were watching out to make sure that the city wasn't being invaded. But what we see is it starts to transition to more of an art term where artists become the advanced guards, so to speak, of society, meaning that they were on the watchtowers, taking a look at the world around them and seeing the problems that might be on the horizon and trying to direct society to a new end or a new ideal. And so this whole idea that art has this greater social importance and impact to lead, guide, and direct society really becomes important and predominant throughout art, beginning with Impressionism. We see subtle transitions or subtle changes of that with realism and their social commentary, calling attention to, bringing awareness to some of the problems that people might overlook or not necessarily see on a day-to-day basis unless they're acutely aware of them and paying attention and having the artistic eye. You might overlook them. And they're trying to call attention to these events so that we can pay greater attention to them and create greater change. Impressionism are kind of take that mantle and want to, take it even further. That art is important. It's socially important. And it needs to be free from traditions. It needs to be free from the salons and the juries of their day to be able to have the freedom to be able to express what they want to express. They can't just go to the salons and the museums and the art institutions and rely on them because they're going to be too rooted in the past. Art needs to change and adapt to reflect the changes and adaptations that are happening within the world around them. So just to kind of give you a background on what Impressionism is responding to. In part, they're responding to some of the larger socioeconomic changes that are happening with the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. But they're also responding to this, right? Photography, which is picking up during the middle part of the 19th century, right? One major aspect that influenced modern art was photography. Photography was invented in the 1820s, and you see here Joseph Nicephore Nape's first known photograph that we have in 1826, and this is outside his window, and so you can see kind of the window here, and then either a building over here, or I'm not sure, it's kind of a grainy photo. Maybe it's some type of silo, not really sure, but giving us a sense of what his scene looks like from the outside, right? And so just to give you a sense of where this is coming from and how this is going to change the art world. Photography allowed people to be able to have their portraits taken by anyone, which challenged the painter's dominance over the visual arts, where you have to go and have a painter actually paint your picture. Now you just have to have someone that has a camera that can, push a button and take a photo. That's an oversimplification of photography. My apologies to photographers out there, but you can see the essence of how that's going to change the artist, right? You look at artist Paul Delarouche said, "From now on, painting is dead." So that was his extreme kind of reaction to this. In many ways, painting the old way was dead. Artists could not compete with the ease and quickness of the camera. Their monopoly on portraits and creating visual histories was over. They now had to compete with science. And so what happens is artists have a direction to go. They can either just continue to paint the world in a realistic representational manner, and then try to compete with a camera, which they're going to lose because camera's a lot faster and more efficient, or they can go a different direction and not paint representational, not paint the way what the world sees, to do something else. And for the most part, art chooses the second route, right? They choose to, rather than focusing on the visual world and representing as realistically as possible, that we see was the direction of art since the Renaissance. They start saying the one thing that the camera to some extent can't compete with is artistic interpretation. And so they start going inward rather than outward, right? So that's going to be a major change. And so I'm going to argue that that's why Impressionism is seen as the first modern movement, is going inward rather than outward. And that's going to continue on for every movement that happens from here on, right? Just to give you a sense of this, right? Just to introduce some of these ideas. If I was to ask you, what do you see here? What's being represented, right? Some people say, well, maybe it looks like it could be a tree. Could be people walking. This could be a squirrel. So maybe they're in a park. Maybe they're in the inner city, and this is some type of, this shadow here is some type of building, right? But if I was to give you the entire image, right? What we saw here is just a detail of this, right? Just kind of give you a reminder of what it looked like. We would say, oh, no, that's a boat. Clearly, that's a boat, right? Now, the objects really haven't changed. The splotches of paint on a canvas haven't changed, but the context has changed. And so what the Impressionists are interested in, or part of what Impressionists are interested in, is how light and shading influence a work and how context changes a work, right? If we put this, the same kind of, paint, the splotches of paint on a canvas, the same dark shadows, but then we surround it with these kind of blue and kind of pinkish and gray hues around it. And then we put there, like this up above, we put this, yellow and orange and red kind of dot in the middle. We say, oh, that's a sun. This must be reflections of the sun. This must be water. This must be a boat, right? And our brain does this instantaneously, right? Just slowing down the process. And then this over here must be some type of ships in a shipyard. This looks like it could be a smokestack out there with industry. So this looks like this is kind of the world around them, and then they are just out on a boat, right? But in a sense, this is what Impressionists are inspired by. They're inspired by this idea of how the eye actually sees, how the eye perceives information. And they're going to kind of take that in new and interesting directions. Now, during the middle part of the 19th century, we also have the development of optometry, studying how the eye sees, studying how the eye perceives light and shadow. And this is all going to be part of Impressionism, right? Helmholtz is a scientist who sees for the first time inside the human eye in 1851, and Snellen develops the eye chart in 1862. And so the idea of trying to understand how the eye perceives information becomes extremely important and influential for the Impressionists. And so Impressionists are taking all these ideas of the social changes, the scientific studies, photography, they're all kind of taking this in and they're responding to it, right? The definition that I have for Impressionism, and it's going to be limited because all definitions have limitations to them, but a good way to start thinking about it, right? I'm going to try to give you these definitions of these modern movements from here on out, because we're not going to be able to have as much detailed studies as we have had in the past art, right? With Renaissance, we studied the Renaissance for about 200 years, almost 300 years worth of work, body of work. And we were able to kind of slow down and just take a look at a lot of art and say, okay, this is what's happening over the time. We saw with Baroque, right? We're studying Baroque art for about 100 plus years. And so that gave us time to slow down and take a look at art individually. With modernism, as the speed of the world starts to pick up with industry, art's going to start picking up and having to change as rapidly as the world around them. And so art movements are going to start happening, every 10 years, maybe every 15, sometimes every 5 years. They're going to be responding. Sometimes they're overlapping. So there's a lot of art that's going to be changing. And so I'm going to try to give you as concise as I can, definitions to help to abbreviate our studies of this and give you kind of a quick window. But each of these movements can have their own semester in and of themselves. Delacroix's death, right? Delacroix, the great romantic painter, and Napoleon III funding the first independent art show in 1863, which became known as the Salon of Rejects, right? They rejected Cézanne, Pissarro, Manet, etc., primed the art world for a new direction. Impressionism culminated in the 1870s. It really starts to take force in the 1870s. Frustrated with the French salons, which turned down 3,000 works in 1863 alone. And so if you wanted to have your art sold, you had to have the stamp of approval of a salon. And the salon would take the works of art, they would judge them based on their merits, and they would give them the stamp of approval, or they would reject them. And if it was rejected, your work of art couldn't really sell on the art market because people only wanted things that were certified by the salons. Well, artists can only take that for so long before they start saying, I'm done with the salons, I'm going to do our own thing. And so Impressionists said, we're done with salons, and they started to band together to do their own thing. Artists band together to create their own exhibition in 1874 that rebelled against the rigid restrictions of the salons. One work of art at the exhibition was Claude Monet's impression Sunrise. The work captures the movement's desire to depict sensory perceptions and study how light and shading influence a work of art. Thus, the movement became known as Impressionism, right? So just to take a look at, these are two works that were done in the same time, the same year, and exhibited, just to show you how different Impressionism was, right? This focus on realism, this is Napoleon, right? The campaign in France, going off to conquer. This is a history painting. But we've seen similar elements of this. This kind of is, there, I guess you can kind of label it, there's some elements of romanticism, some elements of maybe realism in terms of the color palette, in terms of the way that they're being represented. But this one is distinctly different, right? Not necessarily trying to capture exactly what the world actually looks like as realistically as possible. These are quick brushstrokes on a canvas, right? To capture the lighting as it changes. Monet is trying to depict the rising sun before the lighting changes. As the sun moves to the sky, this is going to be, the world around is going to get brighter, and it's going to change the entire landscape. And so he has to paint this as quickly as possible. Very different from the detailed, meticulous brushstrokes that we see in other works of its time, right? Now, it wasn't always, what we think of Impressionism today as this kind of main movement. We just love Monet, we love Renoir, we love all these great artists. At the time, it was considered radical, right? One reviewer, Louis Leroy, said, "Oh, it was a strenuous day." So he went to the art exhibition in 1874, and he just said, it was a strenuous day. It was hard, right? Seeing all these Impressionist works. When I ventured into the first exhibition, call it sloppiness of tone, and I'd understand you better. What crimes are committed? So as he's seeing works like this, he's thinking that art should be this, and he's seeing things like this, and he's just like, it's just sloppy, and it's a crime against art, right? So that's how they kind of seen it. About Pissarro's Horsfrost, one person, he said this, he said, at the sight of this astounding landscape, the good man thought that the lenses of his spectacle were dirty. I must have, someone's spectacles must have been dirty for them to produce this particular work. About Impression's Sunrise, he said, impression, I was certain of it. A preliminary drawing for a wallpaper pattern is more finished than this seascape, right? And so thinking about these works of art, not everyone was a fan at the time because it was radical, because it was so different, right? Or this review, right? It's lively, brisk, light, captivating. What a rapid grasp of the object, and what an amusing facture. Its summary agreed, but how spot on the marks. And so it wasn't all hated. It wasn't all loved, right? So there's some of that tension between them. Sometimes we oversimplify that because they were radical, they must have been widely unaccepted and hated. That's not necessarily true, but they weren't widely accepted at first either, right? It took them a good while, about 10 or so years, before they became wildly popular. Some of the major principles of Impressionism. One, they focus on literal interpretations of light. So focusing on how the eye perceives sensory information, rather than doing something like Romanticism and just, artistic interpretations. They're going to examine sensory knowledge, how light and shading influence a work of art, and how the eye perceives that, right? So that interest in light and shadows. Focusing on everyday life. Urban scenes, particularly in Paris, are going to be quite common. Very similar to what we see with realism, depicting everyday scenes of life, but they're going to have a different angle to that everyday life. They usually use paint applied in thick, short, quick strokes give you the sense of an impression, right? The idea of doing it quickly rather than taking your time in a manner that resembles a sketch. En plein air, which is taking art outside the studio into the actual natural lighting to represent the world as it actually is, those literal interpretations. And so you have the use of painting from tubes, which was new and newly developed at the time to be able to blend colors together quickly. And so this enabled them to be able to help with their actual process, right? Now, what's it rejecting? It rejects artistic emotion, trying to get away from romanticism. It rejects the artistic imagination to add to, enhance the narrative. They're trying to just focus on what the eye sees in a scientific way as quickly as possible. And so in some ways, there is that connection to realism, but their strokes are going to be much more looser. Their focus is going to be much different kind of social commentary, right? And then they also reject this individualistic style that we see with other romantics, such as Goya, right? His style is going to be vastly different than Delacroix and the like, right? So they're kind of having more of a common style. They have a kind of this manifesto. This is what we're going to do. We're all banding together, and this is going to be our art. And that's going to be a big part of the art world. There's these manifestos that try to bring artists together. Another major influence of Impressionism was Japanism. In 1848, Japan opened trading markets, really for the first time in the modern world, right? And Japanese arts entered Europe for the first time. And so as these artists were kind of coming around, they're seeing this art coming from the East, and they're like, this is new, this is different. We want to do something different that hasn't been done before in the Western world. There's something there, right? There were Japanese art exhibits in Paris and London in the 1850s as these works start flooding, right? People are like interested in this exotic art. Impressionists found in Japanese art new ways to frame and construct an image. Artists such as Monet and Degas copied Japanese art. Monet had 231 Japanese prints and continually returned to them for inspiration throughout his life. And the influence of Japanese art on the West is called Japanism, right? One of the main differences is in their representation of depth within a work of art, right? We've taken a look at linear perspective developed by Brunelleschi in 1420, and the idea of the vanishing point and the orthogonal lines all going towards one central axis. And that's really been the standard of art since Brunelleschi, right? Since the 1400s. But what we see with Japanese art is it's quite different. This is kind of unique. This is kind of something that they haven't really seen before, right? We shows new ways of creating the illusion of depth. Hiroshige's prints show this technique with the cliff and the mountains in the background. There's not such an emphasis on converging at a central axis. Lines just merely exist, and there's less structure and organization to them. There's less precision. Yet there's the effect of depth, right? The mountains push diagonally to the upper left, and the lines of the cliff pushes diagonally to the upper right. And so this idea of kind of coming together, converging, to give us that sense of depth within there, right? Hokusai's The Wave. You guys have probably seen The Wave before. It's super famous around, culturally in pop culture. It's also less formulaic. There still is a sense of depth within The Wave. But it's not as rigidly defined with the strict use of lines. There are values that influence Impressionists, and they seek to find methods to recreate this sense of space, right? So this is Monet's Bridge Water Lilies. We see a sense of depth here, but it's not as rigidly defined with the use of orthogonal lines that push to the central axis. It's just that lines exist. Right, so again, there's this, a different way of thinking about space. Now, the major impact of this on the Western art that follows is there's going to be less emphasis on depth. There's going to be more of a flattening of the image to make it more abstract and to focus more on artistic insights rather than literal applications of light. I had the opportunity to go to Monet's home that he had outside of Paris in Giverny. This is his home where he retired and spent the rest of his life. Beautiful little cottage in this beautiful small little town, and they have kept it up. It's now kind of taken over as it's now being conserved, I think, by the state of France, and they opened up as a museum, and you can tour his home. And I mean, I knew of Japanism's influence on him, but I wasn't quite prepared for how much, right? So kind of from the floor to the ceiling, there were all these Japanese prints. And so he was heavily influenced by this. And then you go into the backyard, and then there's a tunnel you go underneath, and then it pops you out here. And this is the river that goes by his home in the backyard. And this is where he receives his inspiration for his water lilies that he spends the rest of his life painting. So beautiful, idyllic, and gave me a lot of insights into Monet, his influences, and just some of the beauty that surrounded him. I want to take a look at this one. This one helps to understand some of the major aspects of their influence of light. So this one, the Rouen Cathedral, Rouen is just a city in France. And he stands out, and every city has their own cathedral, or sometimes several cathedrals. And then he stands out in front of the cathedral and just paints it in the morning, repaints it in midday, and then paints it in the evening, right? But again, he's trying to paint this as quickly as possible. So there's a series of these works, and you can just see the development. You can see the process of him thinking about how light and shading influence a work. And so in some ways, these are artistic representations of the Rouen Cathedral. In other ways, these are kind of scientific studies of how much shading, right? Too much shading kind of blurs the objects together, right? And then too much shading just bleaches everything out, and so not enough details. And so, again, there's just kind of this idea of painting as quickly as you can to capture the quickening, the changing, the rapidly changing industrial world. That's part of the work, but that's also about trying to understand how the eye sees. And this is his poppies, right? So just a field, common everyday events of just going out for a walk in a field. Not necessarily anything romantic about this. This is just, an average day. Trying to give insights to it. Different, though, from realism. Realism has much more of a heavy-handed social commentary of this. Like, what are we supposed to think about? How are we supposed to feel? Trying to give, value to the laborers. This is just about examining life and representing the world as it is, right? Which is unique. Does art have to have a social message to it? Does it have to represent an important social historical moment? Does it have to represent some type of religious idea? What is it supposed to be, right? And they're suggesting, Monet suggesting maybe art can just be pretty. Maybe art can just be wonderful, right? And I have to give props to Monet for his color palette, right? The color choices that he uses in his work are just amazing how they all blend together, right? As I go through and see his different water lilies, you get the sense that there's this, even though they're blurry and they're loose brushstroke, as you stand in front of them and your eyes are trying to focus on them, it feels as though you can kind of reach through the canvas and just touch the water and then have the little ripple that comes across, and it has that kind of feel to it. And as he's representing the seasons as they change, he makes winter feel like winter. He makes the spring feel like the spring, right? So just very, very realistic in the sense, even though it's not trying to be representational realism, it's a different type of realism, capturing the realism, the sense of the world around you through sensory perceptions. As he gets older in life, perhaps due to some developing cataracts and loss of vision, his works become increasingly more abstract. But this is going to be the direction of the art world, right? So this is the Japanese footbridge. I showed you an image of this, the photograph of this. Right, here's the image of it, and I don't know, maybe I didn't have the photograph. Oh, I didn't get the photograph of the Japanese footbridge, but this is the same footbridge, right? But it's represented in the fall, later in life, right? Just giving you the impressions. And so here, what we see here is that we can tell that these are the trees, the changing trees, and then it gives us this kind of subtle hint of this arc that gives us the sense that there's the bridge here, and the bridge just kind of dissolves into the natural settings, dissolves in the natural colors as it's reflecting the water below, the sky above. It kind of absorbs these colors and becomes kind of immersed in it. France commissioned him to do this to celebrate the end of World War I. And so this becomes a symbol of peace. And so they dedicated an entire museum for this specific work, L'Orangerie in Paris. And this thing is massive. And so it's completely, it's not really a circle. It's more of more oblong than that. And what you see here is these These paintings are about 30, maybe 50 feet in length, and these are all water lilies. And the whole idea is just kind of immerse yourself. Sometimes when you're walking around it, it kind of feels like you're in an aquarium or some type of tank in it. There's another one where the viewer is, the photography. I didn't take this photograph because I didn't have a wide enough lens to be able to take it because it was so large. But the photographer here is standing here, and then right behind where the photographer would be standing, there's another image that gives you that kind of 3D immersive experience, right? Taking a look at Pissarro. Pissarro was another impressionist, and he was actually the most radical of them. Very into Marxism and social revolution, anarchy, but his works don't display any of that. It's all kind of, just everyday scenes of people going about their work, enjoying their daily life. Here are the chestnut trees in Osny, and it's just, people walking by, and it's in a forest. It's giving you the sense of what daily life is like. Or this one, the laundry woman, she's just going about her work and her daily labors. Symbolism, right? This idea of focusing on the daily labors and trying to capture that essence, right? Here we see Manet. Manet's works mainly focus on that day-to-day life in Paris and the daily workers, but it's focusing on the daily workers differently than what we've seen with the realists, right? A bar at Folies Bergère is represents this woman behind the bar. She's part of the working class, the proletariats. And then behind her is a mirror. Behind her is a mirror, which is all of the opulence, the wealth of the rising bourgeoisie, the the chandelier above them. And then as they're eating their dinner, they must have some type of entertainment, because we can see just subtly in the upper left-hand corner some shoes of an acrobat as she swings on a swing. And she's kind of looking out with this kind of glazed look in her eye, trying to, wish maybe that she could be part of that. The idea of the bourgeoisie dream, rise above her social circumstances. But this bar here, right, this kind of ledge here, separates her from that world, right? So this becomes this kind of metaphoric separation of social class, that she's not really part of it. And then on top of what separates her are these bottles of champagne, the citrus here, probably tangerines in this, crystal glass bowl, the flowers, all of this wealth is separating her from being able to have access to that. And so in a similar way to what we see with realism, calling a social attention to some problems of the day, right? We see that here. Some impressionists do call attention to those things, right? But they're doing it differently, because where other artists of realism are trying to call attention to the poor and the work of the poor and trying to humanize it, what we see here is he's demonstrating the work of the poor is very problematic, right? She doesn't look happy. Maybe she doesn't necessarily look sad. She just looks dazed, right? She looks like she's kind of not really there. And so rather than celebrating her labor, it's demonstrating some of the problems of what labor looks like in the modern industrial world, right? This idea of not really having any control over what you do and how you can go about your day, right? Being structured by an employer, and how the focus on labor and wages, right? So that's one interpretation of the particular work, right? It says this idea of what separates her from the exterior world is her social economic class. And even though it seems like class mobility is possible, it is actually more complicated than that. Another interpretation of what she's looking at is she could be looking at this person, this gentleman here who's ordering a drink. And so this is a mirror here, so it's reflecting her, right? So this is her back, this is her hair up in a ponytail, right? And then she's taking the order. So she could be looking at this individual to take his order, right? Which would just be a representation of her at work, but again, not necessarily enjoying it, and then also separated from him by the bar, right? But it's also interesting because, if this would have to be, the mirror would have to be at an angle to be able to capture this angle of her, right? So maybe it's her looking at him. The other interpretation that it could be is that she's looking at us, right? She's trying to identify, she's trying to connect us. And then the question is, what are we going to do, right? Now that we're aware of some of the problems, right? She's all dressed up, right? In kind of some fancy uniform, but yet she's not enjoying it. She's not going to have access to this, right? This kind of dream that surrounds her, kind of as this kind of, quasi halo that surrounds her thoughts and her visions, and she's separated from it. The question is, what are we going to do about it, right? But again, he's representing what urban life is like, right? Like the realist, he's capturing, the day-to-day events of the working class, but it's not about people enjoying their work. It's about people that are really struggling. Renoir has a very different take, right? So we see some different styles that are happening with Impressionism. Different Impressionists are focusing on different elements. Monet didn't really depict a lot of people in his works of art. He mainly represented the landscapes around him and the natural world, and focusing on light and sensory. Manet and Renoir do focus a lot more on people. Where Manet is representing the working class, Renoir is representing the bourgeoisies, right? It's representing the rising wealthy class, right? His work gives us this kind of still moment in time, this kind of timelessness. Not necessarily as focused on lighting as Monet is, trying to capture the actual essence of the morning in front of the Rouen Cathedral or Impression sunrise. This one could happen in midday. It could be in the morning. Not really sure exactly what time of day, which gives it this kind of timelessness. The play of light helps to convey maybe a slight time of day, as we see the light kind of play around his clothing here, as it kind of descends from the trees, kind of glistens through. But there's a sense of haziness, right, that makes it feel like it's just this out-of-place time. Renoir's works are generally going to be much more upbeat and happy than Manet's, which is going to have a less kind of heavy-handed social commentary, perhaps. He often used models instead of painting actual people because he wanted to depict the happiness of his day. So Renoir kind of saw these changes. He says, this is a positive thing. Look at all the opportunities and wealth that's out there. I'm going to represent the bourgeoisies and their happiness. And so in a lot of ways, this is kind of him representing the positive elements of the world that they're responding to, right? So we see similar ideas here with Luncheon of the Boating Party, where wealthy people are taking a break from the boat and they're drinking champagne and having lunch. Renoir was fascinated with the new money, and this is what he represents, right? He believed in the dream of attaining a better life, that this was perhaps attainable for people. And so we should celebrate the positive elements of that. And we see that within his work. And it didn't necessarily hurt in selling his works of art to these people as well, right? So there was that component to the work, but he liked the idea of attaining a better life. He liked the idea of wealth and glamour, and this is what he wants to represent. And so these are the people of his time. So in some ways, just like other Impressionists, he's reflecting the world around him. This is part of the world that they're living in, right? Caillebotte is kind of an interesting case study as well. He's also an Impressionist, much more tighter with his brushstrokes than the others. But Caillebotte comes from wealth, and so he funds a lot of the artists, a lot of the Impressionists of his day, and helps them to be able to get established and helps them to be able to make ends meet. And so in a lot of ways, if there wasn't Caillebotte, there might not have been other Impressionists that were able to do what they did because he really helped them to stabilize in a lot of ways. But this is Paris Street, Rainy Day. I love this particular image and how it captures the rain, the water on the streets, and how it glistens from the gray skies up above. I love the detail, the lighting. I love the capturing of this very complicated intersection in Paris where all of these roads are coming to a head and intersecting at the same time. That complexity of the modern world, I love that. I love these two individuals that are just going about their day, just kind of walking. And what the question is, I mean, you can tell that these individuals are all wealthy. He's not representing the poor. This is not the philosopher or the beggar with oysters. This is just people that are wealthy, the top hat, the coat on, they're all dressed up. And what brings them out is shopping and seeing other people out and about, right? So this is about being seen. In a very similar way, what we see with the Dutch Baroque, we see this idea of trying to display wealth without trying to be showy, right? We see that with the new money. They want to show their money. They want to show their rising access to wealth. but they don't want to necessarily look like they're showing off either. And so this is kind of a subtle way of showing off, is just going off and seeing people, interacting with people. They can know your influences. They can know what you've been reading. They can know what kind of art you've been buying. The whole idea is to try to interact with people. And he's capturing that subtly with Paris Street, Rainy Day. We see he's also interested in the laborers. This one is focusing more on laborers. This is the floor scrapers that are scraping the wood floors before they're going to be stained. Again, it's hot in this, upper city apartment, and they have to take off their shirts to, deal with the heat. But it's about them laboring. It's about them working. It's about capturing, what they value, what they're doing, and they're kind of subtly interacting as they go about their labors. Very similar to what we see with other realists, right? Trying to capture the kind of romanticize the element of work. Very similar to other realists in terms of the very tight brushstrokes. But also Impressionists, just trying to capture the urban scenes of the day, right? And so just trying to, not necessarily having a very heavy-handed social commentary that we would see with realists, just demonstrating, just reflecting the world around him. So that kind of attributes him to Impressionism, right? So some things to think about in terms of Impressionism, just the similarities and differences between realism and Impressionism, right? We see some connections, but we also see some severe differences. And then something else to think about would be how each Impressionist is distinct and unique. They carry certain stylistic elements that are common thread between them, but they also have different visions of how they're representing this modern world, the different reactions to these social economic trends. And so just some things to think about in terms of Impressionism and how they're responding to their day.